Donald Trump demanded that European countries double their military spending. The new German government has embraced the open remilitarization of Germany, a major shift in policy for Germany since the defeat of Hitler and Nazism in 1945. The German working class is going to pay a heavy price for this. Anyway, there's a lot there. Let's get started.
This deal comes out of World War II. And what do I mean by deal? The United States needed allies, a bumper between itself and the Soviet Union. They were really afraid, since the Soviets did more to win World War II than anybody else did, and they knew it. And they were afraid of where that might go. Not that the Russians would invade, that was ridiculous, but that the communists inside Europe would have their day knowing that they had an ally to the east. I want to remind people, the first post-World War II government of Charles de Gaulle in France had half a dozen members of the Communist Party of France in the cabinet as ministers. The second most important political party for 20 years after World War II in Italy was the Italian Communist Party, and so it went. This all had to be handled. And how was it going to be handled? You couldn't repress, because they had just come out of World War II with the worst repression imposed by the Nazis, the Germans who occupied. And who had been the hero of fighting against the repression? The Communist and Socialist Party people, who were in a position to make an even better struggle against anyone who tried to do that, again, domestic or foreign. So the United States had a problem. How do you squash socialism and capitalism? Here was the deal. We, the United States, would take care of everything military. We had the dominant military position. We had the atomic bomb before anybody else. We showed we were willing to drop it, as we did in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so we will provide the umbrella. And that will enable you to use the money you might otherwise have used for defense to really compete with the communists. Provide jobs, provide housing, do the social welfare that you referred to. Create the laws, pushed often by the socialists. They simply took the socialist program, the communist program, and they instituted it, and they paid for it, and they had the money because they didn't have a defense establishment, didn't need it. The U.S. provided it. But of course, what the U.S. provided was wonderful for the U.S. Why? Because we took all the borrowed money and pumped it into the military-industrial complex. To provide an umbrella never left the dollar, didn't leave the country, didn't need to. It stayed right here, stimulating the production of bombs and ships and all the rest of it. So you got your Keynesian stimulus at home from military spending, and you had a war on the working class in Europe carried out by your flunkies, the people who built their political career on being slavishly grateful to the United States for protecting them against the evil Russian communists, all of this theater, and underneath it, a social welfare program. What's happening now is the disintegration of that deal. Can't do it anymore. The United States empire is shrinking. It doesn't have the resources. The last few wars it fought, it lost. It doesn't have the money. It can't borrow. The walls are closing in. And so suddenly the Europeans are told dishonestly, now do your fair share. As if they didn't. They had been token flunkies. I want to remind folks, the war in Vietnam that we lost, there were European army factions that came and fought with the United States. They weren't significant, they were marginal, but they were there doing their secondary slavish behavior. So were they in Bosnia, so were they in Iraq, so are they now in Ukraine. And all the screeching that you hear about, how terrible of Mr. Trump to withdraw, that's the screeching of the politicians whose entire careers were the Cold War subordination of Europe to the United States. They will one day be reviled by the people of Europe because of the role that they've played, and they're now going to their end, screeching louder than ever with the nonsense, total nonsense, that Europe and America couldn't win in Ukraine, and now the Europeans are going to do it all by themselves. Not in a month of Sundays. It's pathetic to watch if you understand what's going down. So yeah, they are now going to ramp up their defense spending because they have to. That's the end game of the role they've played, holding back the evil Russians. They're playing out the part that they were assigned all along in this craziness that is a substitute for a politics, because they were subordinate. They were colonies. They don't have their own political situation. And now that the big colonial power is leaving, they're all scurrying around trying to figure out how they can survive. I got news for them. They probably won't. But they don't want to hear that. So they're going to raise defense spending. It's the logic of what they have always done. And that will require them to cut back on social spending, just like you said. And now here's what's going to happen. And, I don't make predictions, but if I were to guess, in France today, when you enter the labor force, I think I've mentioned this on our show here. When you enter the labor force, when you graduate high school or college, whatever job you take, the employer must give you 5 weeks of paid vacation. It's a law. Everybody gets it. Americans don't even fantasize ever having such a thing, but of course we live in the country everybody else wants to move to. Yeah, no, we don't. College is free. In most European countries now, college is free. No tuition, no fees, no nothing. And they all have a birth to death health insurance also. All of those things are going to be taken away because you're compensating for whatever taxes you put on the corporate sector. They will be compensated by not having to give you a paid vacation. They'll be compensated by not having to give as much money to the health system, which will then be contracted the way the British have done with their National Health Service. The only way the Europeans could ever escape from what I'm saying is if they all got together. And under the control of the United States for the last 50 years, they have been sure not to do that, to allow their little petty nationalisms, because that's what they are, petty nationalisms, barely 200 or 300 years old. 200 years ago, there was no Germany, there was no Italy, and on and on. Those things are modern creations. The indulgence of this nationalism, that's all going to dissolve. The British made an effort to save their dying empire by declaring not Russia, Europe was the enemy, and 10 years ago, they left Europe with Brexit. They can't get together for nothing. This is a pathetic group of countries going into the historical dustbin, and it is something we ought to, in a peculiar way, mourn as well as celebrate. Celebrate because Europe's role in the history of the world over the last 500 years is a horrible story of whopping wars that the world had never seen before, world wars. Nobody had ever achieved that one before, and colonialism. Those two lovely achievements will forever. But now we're seeing Europe finally, after half a millennium, 500 years, reverting back to what it was, a squabbling group of different tribal organizations unable to work together. The Goths, the Franks, the Celtics, all the early tribes, you're returning to what you were. And we're all the historical witnesses of this. But the thematic underneath it all is an attack both on the European working class in the way I've described and on the American in the way that is. And what would you be? What is surprising? This is the Republican program, as it has always been, adjusting for circumstances. In the first 100 years, the GOP is against taxes. Today, it's the super tax party, tariffs being the preferred tax it hits everybody with. It's humorous as well as tragic.
Richard, I want to, for folks listening, perhaps maybe even for the first time to our show, but for all of us, just to review some of this very important history that you are using as a reference point. When the Russian Revolution, led by the Bolsheviks, happened in November 7th by our calendar, 1917, Russia was a devastated country. It had lost 3 million in World War I. The size of the Russian economy was about 1/12 the size of the U.S. economy. And then for the next 3 years, when the United States and the European powers invaded, 14 different countries invaded the new Russian socialist government, the country of Russia, 3 million more people died. So Russia was like devastated. Production, even in 1925, was still way below what it had been in 1914 at the start of World War I. So Russia was a poorer country. Soviet Union was poor. And yet they adopted a social insurance program that far, far, far exceeded anything the Europeans knew, the European working class knew, or the U.S. working class. So the idea of 4 weeks paid vacation, that became a reality in the Soviet Union. Women who gave birth had 1 year's paid maternity leave, and it would be 2 years if they couldn't find childcare associated with their workplace. College and education completely free. Employment was a guaranteed constitutional right. You could never be unemployed. I mean, just think of it. And during the 1930s, prior to World War II, when Europe and the United States were in the midst of this capitalist depression, where in the U.S., for instance, 1 out of every 4 workers was unemployed, there was no recession in the Soviet Union because it had a planned economy. So then we have World War II, and all of those capitalist powers in Europe Europe was laying in smoldering ruins because of the magnitude of violence in World War II. The Soviets had liberated a big part of Europe from the fascists. The Soviets lost 27 million people, so the country was very devastated, but it rebuilt itself. So under those circumstances, and when revolutions were happening in China and Vietnam and Korea, the U.S. felt, okay, we're in this dire existential threat against communism, which is now spreading as capitalism lay in ruins, except for the U.S. So Europe was allowed to play this role of being junior partner, having access to world markets, even the defeated adversaries like Germany and Japan. The quid pro quo was that they would be loyal junior partners to the United States on all things. But now I'm looking again at this Financial Times article. Europe started to match, the European capitalists started to match the Soviet social insurance program, as you pointed out. Europe has a small percentage of the world's population, but about 27, maybe 30% of social spending in the world goes to European societies. I'm going to read a couple sentences now to you from the Financial Times, big important financial paper in the UK, about this phenomena of what will happen to this social insurance program if European capitalism goes through with its rearming, which apparently is happening. Here it is. Europe enjoyed its years of low military spending thanks to a prolonged period of protection from the United States, allowing it to build one of the most generous social security systems in the world for an aging population. Across the EU, social protection has grown as a share of total government spending, rising from 36% in 1995 to 41% on the eve of the pandemic. Now, 41% of all of their spending was going for social programs. German government spending on social protection, which included welfare spending and pensions, but excludes healthcare, is more than double that of the United States relative to the GDP. And the difference is even starker for France. And then the Financial Times goes on to say, well, look, it's not guns and butter, it's one or the other, meaning it's social programs or guns, the military spending. Now that Europe is going towards guns, the butter, the social programs, they're going to be eviscerated.